I heard you say one time, I wrote it down here, I loved it so much. You've talked about this idea of youth ministry as a gymnasium for the soul. And I don't know what that means, but I love it. Tell me what you mean.
So that's not original to me. I think the book that came from is one of the most important books. Maybe not for Canada, but for America. It's called The Coddling of the American Mind. Anyone heard of it? Yeah. I think that's the book for youth ministry. One of. I know there are two secular, one's, a secular Jew from NYU, and the other guy's like a brilliant CBT therapist. But they bring up things that I think every youth pastor, if they were honest, is struggling with. It's to preach the truth in love. So right now, what we're seeing and what I'm struggling with is changing my metaphor from a living room or from a therapist's office to a gymnasium of the soul. And my temptation was working with students who I would consider, a bit more culturally and socially fragile. That's not a super huge dig, but how many of you guys would agree with that? What you're seeing right now is students they give off the perception that they can't handle much and they have to leave the room, right? And you're afraid to talk about controversial topics. You're afraid to talk about sexuality. You're afraid to talk about some of these things that are incredibly formative in their world, but coming from a pulpit where you're a truth claim person who's being paid to talk to them, they have all these assumptions about you. It becomes a really hard dynamic to preach the truth in love. Would any of you agree, or is that just me? I'm like, okay. So what that book helped me to do, coupled with a couple of Fuller Youth stuff, is essentially kids long to be challenged, not harmed. It's two different things. But they perceive being harmed. So we have to be the mature leaders to say, nuh-uh, that's not harm, that's challenge. And that's what's helping me kind of reorient. If you get the metaphor, you can build your language on it. And my metaphor went from a therapy session where we were just hearing that this was honestly a weakness of mine because I so agree with the therapeutic movement, but I think the danger is where that therapeutic movement can just be a mirror for them to go and continue what they're doing. Does that make sense? A place for them to offload pain and then just stay the course on wherever they're headed. And that's one of the dangers that I saw in my ministry and in our ministry at Bridgetown Youth. So that quote, gymnasium for the soul, helped me to remember I'm a coach too. I'm a pastor. I'm someone who calls them up to live up. And in the book, they call it a hygiene hypothesis, where the human body, they talked about it, if you don't get exposed, you atrophy. How am I exposing them to the doctrine of sin? How am I exposing them to the practices of confession? How am I exposing them to the gospel of Jesus? Because if not, they're atrophying. I'm atrophying. So where I'm going with that is essentially I started feeling the call to challenge my students, not just comfort them, if you will. And I know that that's cliche and a generalization, but I literally had to shift that metaphor because I believe the temptation for youth ministers is not necessarily to challenge them because we're confronted with a cancel culture world. Does that make sense? I don't know. Yeah. So that's where gymnasium comes in. I'm training as much, and training takes challenge. There's no doubt about that.
I love it, dude. I'm tracking with you.